Well, good morning, folks. Welcome back to Threes In. Bobo here. So, in the comments section here over the past 2 or 3 weeks, I've seen a man's name mentioned that I hold very dear and have a great deal of respect for, a man named Chaytor Mason. Now, Chaytor was an aviation psychologist out at USC, University of Southern California, and he taught on the Air Force Flight Safety Officers course. You know, a lot of those HUP 2, 3, 4 acronyms or words really can get to you at times if you don't pay attention, but be that as it may. So a couple comments were made referencing Chaytor, so I thought, boy, he'd make an interesting topic on one of my stories here alone. So I went to Google, where else, and looked him up, and boy, I found quite a few interesting articles on him, which I'll share with you in subsequent videos. But I came across an accident report that I'd heard about, I think maybe first out at USC when I attended the safety course in 1977. But I heard about it all through my Air Force career. And it was the accident of General George Semler, who had crashed at Randolph on takeoff on his way up the Scott to assume command of Military Airlift Command, MAC, Mother MAC. What I had always thought was that the aircraft had gotten airborne, and then an aileron roll was attempted, and for some reason or another it stalled, and then they speared in, killing both General Semler and his aide, Gil Gillespie. And I had heard bits and pieces, had put together a great deal of the story. The original version I heard had General Semler landing at some point or another, and he was about to put it down in the overrun, and Gil reached up and took the stick and just kind of bumped it, which came up, caused him to balloon through the rest of the overrun onto the runway. And General Semler was really annoyed by that. I think pissed off's a good phrase to use. So again, the story I had heard was that he assigned Gil to command post duty for 2 weeks to let him reflect upon touching a stick when he was flying. Anyway, so that's what I had heard. And then I stumbled across this accident brief, this report here, and a little bit of a different twist in it. And I'm going to share that with you now because it is kind of fascinating. So this is a case study. It was produced by a man named James Albright. And he was able to get this accident report through the Freedom of Information Act request. And it showed up to him with portions of the findings, evaluation, analysis, conclusions, and recommendations redacted, which I'll cover here in a little bit. But be that as it may, he said the odd thing about this explanation is the parts they did disclose that included the names of both pilots. Okay, fine, so we're good to go there. It starts out with the accident report and the narrative, analysis, cause, and then a postscript. So you bear with me here to kind of get organized. The first part is the accident report. 9 September, oh, this is in bullet form, 9 September 1972, time, 12:03 Central Daylight Time, type, Northrop T-38, operator, Air Force, registration, 70-1956, fatalities, 2, crew of 2, aircraft fate, destroyed, phase, takeoff, airport, departure, Randolph, airport destination, Scott Air Force Base, Illinois. They never made it. The narrative. The accident involved T-38 serial number 70-1956, which crashed shortly after takeoff on 14 left at Randolph Air Force Base. Both occupants were fatally injured. The aircraft was destroyed. The aircraft appeared to accelerate normally and lifted off after 3,000 feet of roll. Recomputation of takeoff data confirmed this as the normal takeoff roll. The initial rate of rotation appeared to be normal. However, the aircraft rotated shortly after liftoff to an abnormal pitch attitude. I think they left off the word high, pitch attitude. The aircraft continued to climb in this attitude after attaining a maximum altitude of approximately 150 feet. At about this time, the left wing dropped noticeably and the aircraft began a rate of descent. The nose then appeared to drop toward the horizon, followed by a sudden bank to the right to approximately a wing's vertical position. So what we have here is once he gets airborne, he comes up like this, and first of all the left wing dipped, and then it wing rocked, if you will, to an attitude something like that, and then it began a descent. Okay, less than 150 feet above the ground in a high rate of descent. The descent continued at an increasing rate as the angle of bank decreased back toward the wing's level position. Just prior to impact, the pitch attitude remained slightly nose high. Impact occurred 60 feet right of the runway, 6,800 feet from brake release in a 17-degree right bank attitude, 5 degrees nose high pitch. Airspeed was approximately 198 knots. Now this is kind of significant. There was no attempted ejection by either occupant. The next thing provided is a analysis, and this is the analysis the Air Force provided. We don't seem to be able to get much out of this, do we? So moving on. Cause. Now what's remarkable about this is they do not discuss findings, which usually come before causes and then recommendations. So they just jump right into the cause. Primary cause, undetermined. You gotta be sure. Anyway, most probable cause. Supervisory factor in that the IP allowed the aircraft to be flown into a nose-high, low airspeed, stalled condition at an altitude from which a safe recovery could not be made. Bullshit. Operator possible cause. Operator factor in that the aircraft was inadvertently flown into a stalled condition at an altitude from which a safe recovery could not be made. 2. Material factor in that an undetermined flight control problem caused the aircraft to become uncontrollable. Oh, how convenient. 3. Miscellaneous unsafe factor in that an unknown foreign object was introduced into the flight control system, caused the aircraft to become uncontrollable. Give me a break. And then Mr. Albright says, we were taught at the flight safety course that if the official list of causes don't seem to correspond to the facts of the case, look at the recommendation to find out what really happened. Recommendations, redacted. Big mystery here. I was told by a person who participated in the investigation, see postscript below, that there were no recommendations to correct any material factors in the flight control system or to prevent the introduction of foreign object damage into the flight control system after this crash. Shocking. Therefore, the person said items 2 and 3 listed above are false. That makes sense. So he goes on to discuss here in a postscript. When I attended the Flight Safety Officer course, it was a 3-month-long course taught at Norton Air Force Base, and that's essentially the same course that I had. It was a lot of math, a lot of lab work, and a lot of time dissecting previous crashes to familiarize ourselves with the process. One of our favorite professors was Chaytor Mason, on loan from USC. And he talks a little bit more about Chaytor, which I'm going to get into tomorrow on a presentation of its own. So now he gets into the players, the aircraft, the T-38. It was a high-performance trainer. Well, we all knew that. At one time, it became the bird of choice for the Air Force Thunderbird demonstration team. that performance came at a cost, however. Uh, the aircraft was unforgiving if you got it too slow. Boy, is that ever the truth. The wing didn't stall the way most pilots would expect. Once you got through the critical angle of attack, the wing continued to fly, but with more induced drag than lift. You could develop a high sink rate. And that was so easy to develop, as I talked about in a few presentations about the stall sink rate characteristics of the aircraft. The aircraft on takeoff, the way we would do takeoffs is when we release brakes, we would light the burners and then about 130, 135 knots, bring the stick back to a takeoff position, allow it to fly off the ground. About 160 knots, it came airborne. Now, if you just held that pitch attitude that for takeoff you established, there was really no problem, never any problem at all. And once you got airborne, you checked for two positive, VVI and altimeter. And once you saw that, you called gear clear. And if you were solo, you didn't have to do that. But anyway, then you got your gear and the flaps. Down about the end of the runway, we were approaching 300 knots. And so at 280 knots, we'd pull the throttles out of burner and then rotate to a climb attitude. What's that look like? Well, get me a ride in a 38 and I'll show you. Well, in this case, the aircraft was over-rotated, it sounds like, to an abnormal pitch attitude. And the highest airspeed attained apparently was about 198 knots. That is not good, especially when you've got a high pitch attitude. And then we have evidence that the aircraft began to stall and got into a sink rate. Okay, the pilots. In the front seat was Lieutenant General George Simler from Air Training Command. In the back seat was, in the rear cockpit was Captain Gil Gillespie. I think he'd come out on the majors list at some time during this period. This was considered a highly desirable duty for a young Air Force officer, guaranteed to ensure early promotion, provided he stayed on the general's good guy list. Next, he gets into the eyewitness accounts to the crash. When Professor Mason was called in, the investigation already gathered the usual evidence and spoke to all the witnesses. Every witness said that the T-38 rotated, did an aileron roll, and crashed. It seemed to be perfect. Not only were these witnesses pilots, they were current and qualified in the accident aircraft. These witnesses did the aileron rolls in the T-38 for a living. These were the instructors who taught new instructors how to instruct. The fact that so many of them were certain of the aileron roll gave great weight to that hypothesis. There was a problem with this, however, and this is what I found fascinating. The crash impact site was very small. It appeared the aircraft impacted the ground almost nose first, as it had been nose first. If it had been an aileron roll, the ground impact should have been spread over a larger area. The technical members of the Accident Investigation Board were stumped. That's when they called in Chaytor Mason. So normally on a normal takeoff, we rotate and we're heading down departure in an attitude something like this. If he had done an aileron roll, probably popped the nose up a little bit and then gone into a quick roll and then allowing the nose will fall a lot of times like that. If you watch the Thunderbirds, you see that nose coming up very, very small, but it does come up and then they'll do the roll and then go on their merry way. That wasn't the case. So the next paragraph is one I find kind of, or the next, I'll call it a paragraph here, fairly interesting. It's a discussion on the auger in. So, Professor Mason interviewed many of the witnesses beyond the normal "what did you see" questions, and realized that much of the mindset of the pilots and witnesses were set the night before. And this is one of the fascinating things about Chaytor Mason. he was just brilliant with human factors as they related to accident investigation. So he gets into what they heard in the auger in. The bar's name, auger in, comes from the Air Force slang about augering into the ground as if drilling into the ground. Seems kind of appropriate in the fact when you look at this crash. The pilots, General Sumner and Gill, had just returned from visiting all the Air Training Command bases that the general was in charge of. For each day's takeoff, the general was rotating the nose of the aircraft too high at each one of these pilot training bases. The IP was reluctant to say anything until the flight the day before the accident, when he nudged the stick forward during rotation. The general exploded with anger, telling Gillespie to never touch that stick again when he was flying. So right there, they're set up. And this was a little bit different from the way I heard the story. But it still involves Gil Gillespie bumping the stick. So anyway, we're moving on. That night in the auger in, the general was surrounded by members of his headquarters staff that he had just left, and by many T-38 IPs. He was heard to have said, "Make sure you make it to the flight line tomorrow. I'm going to put on a demonstration of just how to fly the T-38." He was also said to have told a few that his aide did not know how to really get the most out of the T-38. So the stage was set. The next morning, the crowd's view was from across the base, where they could see the T-38 taxi out and begin its takeoff roll. This is a little bit confusing in this paragraph because it insinuates he took off from 1-4 right. And I always thought he took off from 1-4 left. But had the IPs all gathered on the east side of the runway, they wouldn't have seen everything with the clarity that they would have had on the other side of the runway. They would have seen bits and pieces. They would have seen the airplane go into a roll, but not necessarily complete it, and so forth. So that kind of lends some confusion into the whole thing. Gets into what really happened. Given the general's tendency to over-rotate the dressing down he gave his aide for nudging the stick the previous day and his proclamations at the auger in, it appears he rotated to such a high angle the aircraft started stalling right away after takeoff and one wing dropped. And this really makes sense to me. This gave the appearance of the start of the aileron roll. Then the aircraft disappeared from view. The aircraft then reversed its roll as the pilot tried desperately to regain control. The roll reversed again just as the aircraft reappeared to the witnesses, who perceived the completion of the aileron roll. And Chaytor goes into a little bit more of a discussion here. He concludes his input here by talking what it's like flying with senior officers who are more or less legends in their own mind. I had an experience like that once myself. I'll share with you in another video. But be that as it may, we all have had that opportunity to fly with a senior officer, a senior airline captain that was a legend in his own mind. Man, they can get you in trouble. Chaytor summarizes, or Albright summarizes this whole thing. The lesson that should be taken away by the rest of us is that no matter how good we are or think we are, we will be blind to these kinds of hidden dangers. If you're flying the aircraft beyond the limits you preached when you were younger, you're setting yourself up for a fall. If you're responsible for flying with or someone pushing you beyond those same limits, it is important to realize that while holding fast to your integrity could cost you your job, at least you'll be alive to hunt for another job. That kind of sums it up like that. Like I said, when I saw this, having heard about this accident for years, I just thought, oh, this is too good not to share. So that's what this is all about. I also, in the near future, want to talk about 3 accidents, this being one. How I just went offline there. Hope it didn't glitch too much. Anyway, I want to talk about 3 accidents that I'm familiar with that depended on an unknown or transient malfunction, and there were no subsequent inspections done. We call those cover-ups in a lot of ways. I don't know why. Well, I do know why. Either political reasons, or they don't want to hold back somebody's advancement, career advancement, and so forth like that. There's a myriad of reasons like we can get into. But at any rate, I just found this fascinating to think I was going to talk about Chaytor Mason and some of the things I really found endearing about him. I ended up finding this accident. So I'll get back to the other presentation here in a day or so. Until then, good to see everybody. This is Bobo, Base Gear. Stop.